Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your most interesting, challenging source materials and synthesize them into the knowledge you need with all the surprising facts intact.
Today we're unpacking one of the foundational events in American religious history.
The translation of the Book of Mormon. And it's one of those stories where the popular image most people have, Joseph Smith at a table, carefully reading gold plates.
That image.
It just doesn't really align with the evidence from the people who were actually in the room with him.
Not at all. The scribes, his family, their accounts tell a very different story.
So that familiar picture really centers on two things. First, the actual physical gold plates.
Right.
And second, these things called the Nephite interpreters,
Mhm.
which, you often see drawn as silver spectacles. Later, they just started calling them the Urim and Thummim.
But the sources, especially from the scribes, they bring in this third, really distinct element. They talk consistently about Joseph using one or more seer stones.
And one in particular.
One in particular, it was a small, oval, sort of chocolate-colored stone. And crucially, Joseph had found it years earlier in a well, long before the plates.
So our mission today is, well, it's a bit complex. We need to unpack these different instruments, figure out which ones were actually used, and place it all in the context of, 19th century folk magic.
And then trace how and why that physical reality, the whole stone in a hat method, was sort of minimized for more than a century.
Okay, let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
So if we look at the consistent account from the witnesses, Emma Smith, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, what was the one constant defining physical element of the process?
It was darkness, mediated by a hat.
A hat.
A hat. Multiple witnesses say that Joseph would place the instrument, it could be the Nephite interpreters or the separate seer stone, he'd place it into a hat.
And then press his face into it.
Exactly. Pull the brim close to his face to cut out all the external light, and then he would just dictate.
And that dictation process, it was incredibly mechanical, wasn't it?
Oh, very. David Whitmer's account is just a fantastic play-by-play.
What did he say?
He described a spiritual light shining inside the hat, and then this sort of parchment-like surface would appear.
And on that surface?
One ancient character would show up, and right underneath it, the English translation.
So Joseph just reads the English aloud to his scribe.
Right. The scribe writes it down, then reads it back to him for verification.
So there's a check.
A check. And only when the scribe confirmed it was written correctly, the text would vanish, and the next character and its interpretation would appear.
That is almost a perfect definition of what scholars call a tight translation.
It is. And if this brown stone was so central to everything, we have to ask, where did it end up? It wasn't some vision, it was a physical thing.
And it has a clear chain of custody, which is just fascinating.
It does. That chocolate-colored stone went from Oliver Cowdery's widow to Phineas Young, then to Brigham Young.
And now it's held in the church archives. A very real piece of material history.
And this object was also unique because its use wasn't just confined to translating ancient scripture.
Right. It was also used to view contemporary events, things happening far away.
That's a key part of the story. Joseph's use of the stone really extends way beyond the Book of Mormon.
So give me an example. How was it used for other things?
Okay, take the account from David Whitmer. He traveled over 100 miles to bring Joseph and Oliver back to New York.
Right.
Later, Oliver Cowdery told David that while he was on that journey, Joseph had looked into the seer stone and could tell him exactly when David started, where he stopped each night.
No way.
Yes. And even the names that were painted on the hotel signs along his route.
So he's basically using this object like a kind of spiritual GPS.
Or remote viewer, yeah. It's a huge jump from translating scripture, but it shows the practice was consistent.
And this was reportedly the same stone he'd used earlier in his life to find the location of the gold plates.
Even after the angel Moroni had already told him where they were. It just shows that this skill set, this ability to find hidden knowledge with a material object, it completely predates the Book of Mormon project.
And that skill set, as you call it, it really plants this whole story firmly in the context of early 19th century American folk culture.
Absolutely. Using seer stones, they called them peep stones or glass-looking, to find lost items or buried treasure was remarkably common.
So this wasn't some strange, exotic practice.
Not at all. It was regional spiritual technology. We know from the sources that Joseph's neighbors had them. Sally Chase had a green one. William Stafford had one.
But Joseph's involvement went a bit deeper, didn't it? Into what they called money digging.
It did. The 1826 trial, where he was charged as a glass looker for, practicing these divining arts, that confirms it.
And he was found guilty.
Well, he was released as a disorderly person, not a criminal, but the record of him using this exact same seer stone in a hat to look for treasure is solid.
I find the descriptions of these treasure hunts almost cinematic. They're so colorful.
They really show this incredible blending of the supernatural and the practical.
Like what?
Joseph Capron, a local guy, described one dig where they were looking for a chest of gold watches guarded by an evil spirit.
Okay.
And to keep the spirit away, they used stakes and a polished sword as defense measures while they were digging.
And William Stafford's account.
Right. He talked about the smiths digging at night, believing Joseph could see these large caves and gold bars and spirits in ancient clothing, all by using the stone in the hat.
It just puts the entire translation event in this very specific, very strange local cultural context.
And what's really fascinating is how that folk concept of, tricky disappearing treasure actually seeps into the sacred text itself.
You're talking about slippery treasure.
Exactly. That's the perfect link. Martin Harris, the first scribe, said when they first found the stone box with the plates, by some unseen power, it slipped back into the hill.
Which is almost identical to the language in the Book of Mormon itself.
Right, precisely. In the book, the prophet Samuel the Lamanite curses the people's riches, saying they'll become so slippery that they can't be held onto.
It's an undeniable connection between the folk magic he was living and the narrative he was dictating.
It is.
So let's address the elephant in the room here. The claims that the Smith family was into full-blown ritual magic things like a Jupiter talisman or magic daggers. How do we deal with that?
Well, we have to look at the conflicting viewpoints and really focus on the strength of the evidence. Critics definitely claim deep occult involvement.
But the evidence for things like the Jupiter talisman.
It tends to rely on very weak, very late, secondhand testimony. I mean, the talisman claim comes from a guy named Charles Bidamon, 58 years after Emma Smith's death.
And it wasn't on the list of his belongings when he died.
Correct. No talisman was listed. And you have to remember, his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, she explicitly pushed back against all of this.
What did she say?
In her history, she flatly denied the family was involved in drawing magic circles or soothsaying. So while the money digging is well documented, the claims of deeper ceremonial magic are on much shakier ground.
Okay, so now that we get the processed stone in a hat and the context folk divining, we have to confront this major contradiction.
The role of the physical plates themselves.
Exactly. If the translation was truly revelatory, just words appearing on a stone, why were the plates even necessary?
It becomes this huge point of confusion. Emma Smith, who was often the scribe, said the gold plates often lay on the table, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth.
And Joseph rarely even touched them.
Right. Sometimes they were even in a different room. So if the text is just being generated by looking into a stone in a hat, the physical presence of the plates is, well, you could argue it's irrelevant to the actual dictation.
I'm really interested in the implications of that tight translation theory. If God was dictating the final English words, why are there human fingerprints all over the source material?
That is a fascinating challenge to the purely revelatory idea.
Explain that.
Well, we have sources with copies of the characters Joseph copied from the plates, right? The characters document. Non-LDS scholars who've looked at these, they note that they don't really resemble any form of Egyptian. Instead, they look a lot like modified English letters and symbols.
Like the English alphabet, just rotated and tweaked.
Exactly. So if the whole purpose of the plates was to preserve an ancient language, why would a character-by-character translation produce symbols that seem so clearly derived from English?
It strongly suggests a human element in the design or the interpretation of that writing.
It absolutely challenges the idea of a purely divine, unmediated dictation. And this brings us right to the moment the instruments actually changed, linking the process back to human error.
You mean the 116 lost pages incident?
Right, where Martin Harris loses the first manuscript. David Whitmer claimed that because of this mistake, the original Nephite interpreters were taken away.
So after that, Joseph continued the rest of the Book of Mormon translation using just the brown seer stone he already owned.
Yes. And the incident itself is pivotal because Joseph then receives a revelation, it's in D&C 10, that forbids him from retranslating it.
Because his enemies would try to expose contradictions if he dictated it twice.
That was the reason given. But here's the internal contradiction. If that seer stone was powerful enough to track David Whitmer over 100 miles,
Which we just discussed.
then why couldn't Joseph just look into that same stone and simply view the lost pages to confirm they were accurate?
That's a powerful point.
Yeah.
It suggests a limit to the stone's power when it comes to accountability for the text itself. This is also where we get that classic anecdote about Martin Harris testing the stone.
Yes, he wanted to know if the stone really worked or if Joseph was just, making it all up. So he swapped the seer stone for a regular rock that looked similar.
And what happened?
Joseph put his face in the hat and immediately said, "Martin, what is the matter? All is as dark as Egypt." So it shows the stone itself, whatever its power, was unique and responsive.
Let's shift to the debate about Joseph's ability. The traditional story is that he was too uneducated to write the Book of Mormon on his own.
That's the narrative, yes. Emma Smith's late testimony supported it. She said he couldn't write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter.
But there's conflicting evidence on that, isn't there?
There is. His 1829 letter to Oliver Cowdery and his 1832 account of the first vision, they show he had a pretty sophisticated and eloquent writing style. He wasn't some illiterate farmer.
And the raw dictation itself seems to support the idea of a rapid oral production, not some careful, edited writing process.
Oh, the original manuscript was incredibly raw, no punctuation, and just littered with grammatical and spelling errors.
Like what?
Phrases like, "I have wrote this epistle," or "Adam and Eve," which was our first parents. It really tells you the language was being dictated orally and fast, probably unedited as it came out.
Speaking of speed, the timeline is often held up as this miracle of production. How fast was it, really?
Well, the whole translation was done in about 85 effective dictation days. If you take the total word count, about 274,000 words, that breaks down to roughly 3,200 words per day.
Which sounds like a lot.
It does, but if you assume a conservative dictation speed of 1,200 words an hour, that only required about 2 hours and 40 minutes of dictation each day.
Which is completely plausible for a task he may have been mentally working on for years.
Exactly. His mother, Lucy Mack Smith, claimed Joseph had been working out the stories of the Book of Mormon people in his head for years before the translation even started. So the speed is impressive, but maybe not miraculous.
So we had this clear, consistent historical record of a rock-in-a-hat translation. But for decades, it was pretty much ignored by the institution he founded. What does that narrative shift tell us?
It tells us that history can be really hard to integrate into theology. The historian Richard Bushman acknowledged that the church's long-standing dominant narrative is not true and had to be reconstructed.
And this detail about the seer stone, it wasn't widely known or taught.
No, not in Sunday school, not openly discussed, really, until the church started releasing its transparency essays around 2013-2015.
The visual history of the church confirms this discomfort perfectly.
It really does. For decades, official church art showed Joseph reading directly from the plates. It's just an easier image to convey sanctity and ancient authority that way.
And it wasn't until around 2017 that new, official art started showing the stone-in-hat method.
Right, finally aligning the visual history with the written witness accounts. It was an easier sell, visually, to show the prophet reading a gold Bible than with his face in a common hat.
And this required a bit of a linguistic shift, too.
A huge one. The term Urim and Thummim was generalized by Joseph and his associates early on to mean any stone used for divine communication.
Which allowed the church later to use that revered biblical term when they were actually referring to the more commonplace brown seer stone.
It was a convenient blending of terms.
Before we wrap up, we have to talk about Jane Manning James. Her story provides such a unique, powerful perspective on who had access to these secret objects.
Jane Manning James was a Black pioneer and a very trusted figure in the Smith household. Her account is just extraordinary.
Why that?
Because Joseph's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, actually permitted Jane to handle what was identified as the Urim and Thummim. Jane described it as a heavy metallic object on a circular base.
That is a remarkable level of intimate access to the founding artifacts of the whole religion.
It is. And of course, Jane was later denied full participation in temple ordinances because of the church's racial restrictions at that time.
But her memory of handling those sacred objects.
And she also handled Joseph Smith's temple robes. It all acted as this silent, powerful protest. She was pointing to her early intimate relationship with the most sacred materials of the church's founding as proof of her worthiness.
Implicitly challenging the later denial of full spiritual privilege based on her race.
Exactly. It's a moment where a so-called peripheral figure really highlights the deep trust that existed early on before those institutional barriers went up.
So what really stands out to you at the end of all this? For me, it's that lasting tension. The most consistent, earliest accounts of this sacred history. They detail a method, a rock and a hat, that's just utterly commonplace.
And rooted in 19th century folk divining.
Right. And that history was then obscured for a century until modern pressure forced the institution to finally reconcile its public narrative with his own witness accounts.
I think the key takeaway for you is realizing that Joseph Smith's spiritual world just wasn't compartmentalized the way we might do it today. The sacred translation, the remote viewing, the treasure hunting.
It was all connected.
It was all mediated through the same set of tangible, folk magic adjacent objects, like that chocolate-colored stone. It shows the spiritual continuum that modern observers often really struggle to accept.
So if we accept this complex blending of folk culture and revelation, here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on. If the translation was strictly dictated, character by character, and purely revelatory, why was it necessary for Joseph to have been mentally rehearsing the narratives and working out the complex stories of the Book of Mormon people for years beforehand, just as his mother said? Does that whole process, revelatory, yes, but also requiring the correct physical stone and years of narrative incubation, does it suggest that maybe revelation requires deep, pre-existing human effort and mental preparation to even happen?